We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. A new world order is emerging as the old one decays. China, South Korea, Japan, and other Southeast Asian countries in ASEAN announced this week in a joint comprehensive project in reaction to Trump's tariffs that they intend to build a trade infrastructure and reduce dependence on Western financial institutions. Richard, Professor Wolff, thank you. Welcome back.
Glad to be here, Brian, and Richard is fine. Professor, you don't need.
I'm tipping my hat, Richard. You're
Okay.
Professor Wolff to us.
All right.
All right. Well, what's noteworthy about this news story, Richard, is that China, Japan, and South Korea and the countries of ASEAN are banding together. I mean, literally banding together. And they don't say it explicitly, but it's clearly in response to Trump's economic policies. They say in their statement, in their joint statement, we call for enhanced regional unity and cooperation as we endeavor to weather the heightened uncertainty. And then at the end, they say, amid rising uncertainties and long-term structural shifts, we reaffirm our full commitment to multilateralism and a rules-based, non-discriminatory, free, fair, open, inclusive, equitable, and transparent multilateral trading system. Now, Richard, this includes Japan and South Korea. The United States occupies both countries. They're both considered primary allies of the United States since 1945. Anyway, we said in the beginning, in the intro, and you and we have discussed in past weeks, this is another clear sign that the old world order, the one that was created in 1945, is in fact coming to an end. Let's get started.
Yes, it was already in decline. It has been now for, depending on how you count, at least 10, maybe 15 years. Some of us have for some time been saying things like declining empire or declining Western capitalism. What you're seeing now is the acceleration of that process. And that's, I think, the best way to understand what might otherwise seem so jarring. I mean, the United States, being a declining empire, is now doing what declining empires often do, which is shaking its fist, angry at the elements that have made this decline happen to us, looking around the world and saying, in the words of our president, they've all been cheating us. They've all been taking advantage of us. We are the victim of a badly organized universe that is targeting us, and we won't stand for it. I mean, it's a theatric that you ought to recognize as being part of what declining empires do. And then, again, not surprising, when the declining empire gesticulates and throws around accusations and hostilities, the people it does that to begin to recoil, to do exactly what the ASEAN nations have now done, as you've reported it, and you get an acceleration of the very decline as a reaction to the decline. It kinds of a spiral, if you like, that feeds on itself. Let me give you a couple of more. When I woke up this morning, the headline in the first news report I saw refers to an official high in the Trump administration that referred to the new government in Canada as, I quote, socialist, and therefore a sort of enemy of the United States. Mr. Carney, a former director of the Bank of England, which gives you a credential of establishment beyond which I wouldn't know other than maybe a king or queen or something else might do. So to call his election a victory for socialism isn't about Mr. Carney or about Canada or about the Bank of England. It's about a mentality in the United States that is the same as what has now provoked those nations in Asia. It is just this side of preposterous. I follow the work of a professor at the University of Denver. I won't mention his name. I haven't asked his permission to do so. But he's a wonderful thinker about supply chains. And he reminded me over the last 24 hours of something said at the meeting yesterday, I believe, or the day before, when Warren Buffett announced that he was retiring from the Berkshire Hathaway Corporation that he has led for many decades. He's, I believe, 94 years old. He's retiring. And he was asked at his last corporate meeting before his retirement, which I believe takes effect later this year, he was asked what he thinks about Trump's tariffs. So he cleared his throat. This is, by the way, another one of the 10 richest people in the world because of what he's established with Berkshire Hathaway. And he said that in his judgment, the job of the world, of the United States in the world, is to encourage other people to produce what they're good at and exchange it with the United States producing whatever it's good at. That was a polite way. He's a polite man. It was a polite way of saying he's horrified by the Trump tariffs, because what that does is it weaponizes international trade. It means everybody now has to think not about, can I produce the best product at the lowest price, et cetera, and therefore find a market for it, and if so, where and how? I mean, it's bad enough, I say that as a critic of capitalism, it's bad enough that profit is so often the only variable that determines where goods get produced and how much they travel around the world. I was no fan of globalization and neoliberal international trade, those rules talked about in that statement you just read, because what it meant was, for example, that over the last 40 years, the United States moved a great deal of its manufacturing out of the United States and took it to China or India or Brazil or elsewhere. That was good for profits, which is why it happened. But whether it was good for us as a people, I don't think so. For example, it meant that the production was 10,000 miles away from the consumption. That's not a good idea. That creates what we have come to call long supply chains. Very easy to be disrupted, very easy to be undone. It means you need freighters to carry all that junk produced over there here. And they pollute the air and they pollute the water and they mess up the oceans and they chaos the fishing. On and who calculates that? Answer, nobody. Who asks the obvious question? Is the social cost of that way of organizing the location of production maybe greater than the private profit of those who make the decision? And if it is, we get the solution that private profit is not an appropriate guide to things such as the location of manufacturing. So I'm no partisan. But I understand what the Chinese and the South Koreans and the Japanese are doing. These are countries that are completely dependent on international trade. And they are watching one player, not just using the profit motive, because they all use that, but using a nationalist security apparatus to manipulate even further. So now we get a global reorganization based on private profit and the nationalist imperative of the United States. No wonder they're freaked out. Where does that leave them? They then become the collateral damage of the American project. They're not ready to do that anymore. That would have been possible in the 1960s or 70s or 80s, but not anymore. The way the world has grown, the fact that China has grown much faster than the United States makes that kind of a policy crazy. And Mr. Warren Buffett is clearly aware this is not good news at all.
I want to mention and talk a little bit with you about the specific case of South Korea. The United States and South Korea signed a free trade agreement. It's called the South Korean-U.S. FTA, Free Trade Agreement. They signed it in 2012. I was involved in protests, by the way, Professor Wolff, both in the United States and in South Korea, working with the unions and some of the peasant organizations in South Korea against the FTA for the same reason that you just mentioned, because many of the globalization elements in the free trade agreements were very detrimental to workers in the United States and workers and farmers in South Korea. But anyway, the FTA allowed for U.S. exporters to basically have complete access to the South Korean market, which basically really harmed South Korean farmers in particular. So they were some of the bigger protests. But there was already this free trade agreement. In other words, the tariffs that had been allowed by South Korean government and tolerated by the United States in order to build up South Korea as a capitalist model in contrast with the communist North Korea, the things that happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Before 1969, North Korea's economy was actually bigger than South Korea's economy. But they had already done all of this. And now you have Trump coming in and saying, yeah, we're going to tariff South Korea, a country that the U.S. also occupies with 30,000 U.S. troops. And now you have South Korea blocking with China. I mean, the irony of all of this from a historical point of view can't actually be overstated.
No, it's an extraordinary object. But again, I don't want to beat this horse into a premature death. But when you look back on the decline of empires, what you often find, it first happened when I was a student and my professor scratched his head. I remember noticing it as he explained to us, so he wanted to illustrate it with his body motion, that you can't believe what they did. How could they be this blind, you say, about emperor this or that as he watches his empire dissolve underneath him? How could he not see this? How could he not take appropriate action to stop this or to start that? You can't quite imagine it. So I think it takes a bit of a leap, which is what I'm proposing now. You have to somehow try to put yourself in the mentality of the people designing and executing this policy in Washington at this time. These are people who are, and I want to use this word advisedly, freaked out by the decline of the United States. Refusal to understand it, refusal to even think it, and insisting on marching ahead with the troops that are not there and the weaponry that's all rusted out. You can't do this anymore. You can do something. You don't have to throw in the towel. We're not going to become Yemen tomorrow. That's not the issue. But you cannot do what they are doing. when Mr. Trump or someone in his entourage refers to the leader of Canada as a socialist, when it's revealed that earlier last week, I believe, President Trump proposed to the leader of Mexico that U.S. troops be sent into their country, Mexico, to help them fight the drug traffickers. You're beginning, when you add that to Greenland and Panama, what is going on here? What kind of a megalomaniacal kind of notion of the United States is here? And it will be, I say this with real confidence, it will be another one of the empire declining mysteries that historians of the future, when you and I are long gone, will be puzzling their heads about. How did they lose it all so suddenly, so precipitously?
Yes, I totally agree with you. And because it makes no sense on its face. I mean, the global system has worked quite well for the US capitalist class. They constructed it, they built it, they conceived of it between 1943 and 45. So it's an element of self-destruction. But this is the thing that I think is important for our audience, the point that you just made. This is largely ideologically driven, although there is a material basis. The material basis is the decline of the empire, but the ideological basis is profound. You mentioned the American government is now calling Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, a socialist and the head of a socialist government and thus an enemy. Stephen Miller just went on, had a press conference. He's a senior advisor to Trump. He said, we have to dissolve the Department of Education and defund all of these schools around the country because they are teaching communist ideology to our children. Now, as a Marxist, Richard, I think we can tell the audience there's nothing about the American public education system that remotely is connected to communism, but this is actually a driving force in their decisions. I mean, this is an ideological wing of the American ruling class has taken the wheel, has taken the helm, and they're driving this thing and appear to be driving it under the bus. And at the same time, many institutions in America are basically capitulating. A few are standing up. Anyway, it's ideological, although not only ideological.
That's right. And the ideological, the way I understand it, is as follows. Both the Republican and the Democratic parties are parties that are now dependent on money and money from large donors. There are some exceptions. Bernie was able to raise an enormous amount of money from the average people, giving him whatever it was, $23 on average per person. But in general, the Republican and Democratic parties work as follows. They have mega donors. They're the ones who give the big bucks. And then it is the job of the party apparatus in each case to take the big bucks and to use it to weld together a winning coalition of voters. Take the money and then do what you can to collect voters. So the Republicans, we all know, they go and collect the fundamentalist Christians, the people who are in love with their guns, the people who don't want there to be abortion, and so on. And the Democrats take their money and they all go and organize black and brown people and women and trade unionists and educated folks from the university. We really all know that's how the game is played. What we didn't understand is that when that arrangement begins to weaken its ability to keep in power, along will come somebody, Donald Trump, who will put this system on steroids. He will explain to the other Republicans, you got the money from the rich people, like me, and you used it the way you're supposed to, but you didn't do a good job. You didn't really get enough people revved up enough to win the election, and you let the Democrats do that with their unions and their black and brown people and all of that. And the Democrats had the same problem. Bernie came and said, you're not able to do half the things you need to do to stay the party of the working class. You need someone like me. And they did. But the first one to get in was Mr. Trump, because the right is much freer to function in this country than the left. And that has been true ever since the Great Depression. So Mr. Trump was able to do it. Why am I telling you this? Because he went and had to collect the white supremacists, the ideologues, all of those people who inhabit the Republican side of this game. And he had to do it on steroids. He had to give them a much louder voice. White supremacy became real because of him. He went and said, I'll give you a bigger voice. He did. He went to the anti-abortion people, gave them a bigger voice. He did. The gun people, he did. And that's why Stephen Miller and all people like that are in these positions they themselves never thought they'd quite arrive at. So this is their chance to do what they've been babbling about all their lives. If Bernie got in, you'd be sitting there doing some of these things, hopefully doing it better than they do it, but you understand what I'm saying. And we're getting this, we have the equivalent of the House Un-American Activities Committee holding hearings today about anti-Semitism against Haverford College in Pennsylvania, among other institutions. What is going on? These are people who, if there were serious interest in anti-Semitism, who would be on the receiving end of investigation, but they are instead mounting the we are reaching levels of absurdity that are another sign of a serious decline. The whole world is turning against the United States. People should, if they really want a historical equivalent, let me frighten you and give it to you. It's the Nazis. All of Europe, even to this day, 75 years after the end of World War II, there are large parts of Europe who don't react well when German tourists visit their part of the world. And if you ask them why, it's the memory of a notion of Nazism as a scourge that invaded Europe at a certain point. And why? Because in the end, the Nazis were people who horrified much of the rest of the world. We are now watching, as in the ASEAN meetings, erstwhile allies of the United States getting together, issuing public statements by the highest officials in the country that portray the United States as a danger and a threat. Let me assure you, as unemployment rises in these countries as a consequence of disrupted international trade, where do you think the leaders of these countries, called socialists or something else negative, what do you think they're going to say to their people? Where do you think they're going to direct the bitterness and the anger at the empty shelves in the stores, at the lost jobs, at the defunct incomes? That's all going to be pointing to Donald Trump and the Americans. That's what we're heading into. And we're being led by people who take all of that as almost a sign of success, a badge of their courage. This is a very scary operation that's being unfolded here by people who seem to need to tell the rest of us that they know, yeah, it'll take some time, but they know this is all going to work out. You don't buy a used car from a person who talks like that.
Richard, last point. my family comes from Western New York, Rochester and Buffalo, New York, industrial centers historically. So a lot of in my extended family, a lot of working class folks. We were all together in 2016 before the election, and it's a very mixed bag family, as all families are, as you can imagine. But a number of my working class cousins and uncles, they're not politically leftist at all, not at all. But they were going to vote for Bernie. They were intrigued by Bernie. They liked his message. They thought it was refreshing. And they've been screwed by corporate America. Western New York Buffalo, New York got hollowed out.
Yep.
And so these are folks who traditionally, a generation ago, they would have thought, oh, life is going to get better. Nobody thinks that now. Anyway, the Democrats crushed Bernie. They really crushed him, and they crushed him again in 2020. It was a deliberate effort. They decided they would rather take the chances of having bad candidates like Hillary Clinton go against Trump and lose to Trump rather than have Bernie, who's not a communist. He's really just kind of a left liberal, but they would prefer that risk rather than having Bernie. So anyway, my point is Bernie's crushed. My relatives who were pro-Bernie, they voted for Trump. I'm not talking about my immediate family, my cousins and uncles. Trump appealed to Bernie supporters too. And it also says so much about the Democratic Party establishment actually weirdly fears its liberal wing more than it fears Trump. That's what's actually facilitated the rise of this right-wing grouping.
Yeah, and let me tell you why. I agree with you. I understand it. It's my own experience as well. Here's the reason. Franklin Roosevelt was a politician, more or less like the rest of them, coming from a very well-connected family who had already had a member of the Roosevelt family, President Theodore Roosevelt earlier. He ran his early campaign as a middle-of-the-road, what we would nowadays call a centrist Democrat. I remember looking at his literature of his first race. He believed in a balanced budget. He didn't want to have deficit spending, even though he was running in the early years of the worst collapse of capitalism in the history of that system. So you can tell this is no lefty. But he was a smart politician. And when the ground opened up underneath him, when the economy really collapsed and there was a sudden movement, and I want to remind people, it was a movement of the American working class sharply to the left. They joined the CIO unions in a way millions did it, never had done that before in America. These were young people who came from families where nobody knew what a union was, let alone had been active in one. And people joined two socialist parties, a conventional one and a Trotskyite-linked one, and a U.S. Communist Party. And they all worked together with their differences, but they all worked together. And they went to the president and they said, you better do something for us or you're not going to be president very long. In a way, they said to him what you just told us about your family in Western New York. And he was smart enough to realize they had the votes. They had 30 million people, well organized. You're not going to defeat the Republicans if you don't have them. You're dead. So he made a deal. I will give you what you demand, but you've got to stop talking about revolution. And with lots of disagreement and lots of grumbling, the New Deal coalition, unions, two socialists, and one communist party, made that deal. They downplayed the revolutionary rhetoric, and they went to support it. And we got Social Security, minimum wage, unemployment compensation, and a 15 million person federal jobs program. The most progressive period of American history. No other period is even close. But here comes the punchline. This president paid for all of that in the middle of a depression when the government had no money by taxing corporations and the rich, which is where the money was. And he told them, you better give me half of what you got, because if you don't, there'll be a revolution and you won't got anything anymore. So this is a good deal for you. Half of them went along. The other half went to work to found the John Birch Society and the whole right wing of American history since that time. Mr. Roosevelt, who dared to tax corporations and the rich to provide a massive program of support to the working class, was reelected 3 times. That's why they had to crush Bernie. They know where that can go. They know where that can lead. And they're terrified on behalf of their donors what that might mean. They don't want to go through that experience, and they don't want to have, once again, such a government produce the reaction of the ruling class, which has been the undoing of the New Deal, which is our politics in this country since 1945. They have all that in their head, and they don't want to risk it at all. And that tells you as much about American politics as you can digest at one time, but it is the story of this country's situation.